So quickly to the panel, Dr. Norbert Peabody is the editor of Modern Asian Studies, which is a bi-monthly journal that publishes cutting-edge articles, research on modern Asia, and it's based out of the Center of South Asian Studies at the University of Cambridge, which is where Norbert is also based. His background is in art history and anthropology, which is an interesting combination, and he spent a number of years working in Kota. A lot of his publications have been, a lot of his research has been about how governing power and authority and rulership worked in pre-colonial India, and also what were the challenges, some of the challenges to that power. Along with Ramya Srinivasan at the University of Pennsylvania, he is currently co-editing a new edition of James Todd's Annals and Antiquities that will be published in 2020 in time for the RAS bicentenary. His co-editor has written a book called The Many Lives of a Rajput Queen, which you might want to consult. It's very topical given what's been dominating the news in Rajasthan certainly, and many other parts of India over a certain film. Dr. Reema Huja is my colleague at the City Palace. She's currently the Consultant Director of Library and Archives. She has vast and varied experience in academic and heritage administration, including as one of the trustees of the Jaipur Virasat Foundation. Reema likes to call herself a lapsed archaeologist because even though that's what her background is, most of her publishing has been what you would call, what you would classify as history, most of what she's published. And she's, of course, best known for her history of Rajasthan. But she's here today also because she's done a lot of work on the Todd collection of manuscripts at the RAS. And finally, Dr. Giles Tillotson is also a colleague at the City Palace. He's the Director of Research, Publications and Exhibitions. He's a specialist on Rajasthani Mughal and colonial architecture and the art history of South Asia, including its interactions with Europe. He's a former reader in art history at SOAS, and he's a former director at the RAS, that's the Royal Asiatic Society. And of the 12 books on art, history and architecture that he's written and edited, one of them is a book called James Todd's Rajasthan, the Historian and His Collections. Marg Publications published that book in 2007, and that emerged from a Todd research project that Giles ran while he was director at the RAS. So what I share with the panelists is a professional engagement with Rajasthan. What I share with you is a curiosity to discover more about this influential but also unusual figure from the 18th and 19th centuries on whom I think both Britain and India have a claim. So, to our questions, I'd like to start by asking Norbert to tell us a little bit about this new edition that the RAS is bringing out. You'd mentioned that it would take, that the edition would reproduce the original text. So what is it that we've been looking at in bookshops until now if it wasn't the original text? What does that mean?
Well, thank you for your question. You may ask, why do we need a new edition of James Todd's Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan? You can find it in every palace bookstore in North India, and many of you probably have it on your desk or on your library bookshelf someplace. And what I would say is that most of the reprints and editions that are currently available are based on a 19th century, early 20th century editions of the text, which had changed the original text radically. The original text, which was published in 1829 and 1832, was lavishly illustrated with engravings, but also richly illustrated with reproductions of archival documents, and in addition to having a certain aesthetic that was associated with it, that was very expressive of the era in which Todd lived in Rajasthan and the era in which this book was produced. All these attributes of the first edition were eliminated in later reissues and later reprints of the Annals and Antiquities. And so part of the project that Ramya and I have is to restore the text to its original aesthetic and to try to restore it to help the modern reader understand what the agenda was that Todd had in writing this text. So we are aiming to do three things in this reissue of the Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. First, a very simple matter of restoring the text to as it existed in the 1829 and 1832 editions. This means restoring certain chapters that have been eliminated in later editions, restoring all the illustrations, and also giving some sense of the aesthetic appeal of this really wonderfully produced set of tomes. The second part of the restoration project, which we aim to do, is to provide some sort of context that would help the modern reader understand what Todd's agenda was in writing this text. When one reads the text nowadays, one is often overwhelmed with literary allusions to romantic poets, of British romantic poets, as well as allusions to various Rajasthani literary traditions, Prithviraj Raso and various Vanshavali traditions. And these are very difficult for modern readers to understand. So what Ramya and I are doing is, in addition to the 2 volumes, reproducing the 2 volumes of Todd's text, is we're producing an annotated 3rd volume, a companion volume, which will provide some of the background for Todd's literary allusions. And it'll be possible to have the Todd's volume on one page and the annotations on another page. And one can go back and forth between Todd's texts and our explanations of the text. The third thing that we're trying to accomplish in this reissue is to restore a number of suppressed voices that had existed in the first edition, which progressively became eliminated in later reprints. We now think of Todd's Rajasthan as a book by James Todd, full stop, a single author. And yet in the first edition, there are many other voices that appear in the text. And Ramya and I are trying to tease out those voices and make them heard more clearly for the modern reader. And what's interesting about those voices is that they are voices of James Todd's Indian interlocutors. He had a number of native informants with whom he lived over an extended period of time, and on whom he relied for his understanding of Rajasthan. We know the names of many of these people. Gyan Chandra was his most famous interlocutor. Maharana Bhim Singh Mewar was another one. His sort of court artist by the name of Ghazi was yet another one. And one of the things that Ramya and I are aiming to do is to bring these characters who shaped Todd's vision of Rajasthan in many ways back to life through our explanation, through our introduction to the text, and through our annotations.
One of the other things that you mentioned was that the new edition would be bringing back all of the images that were there in the original, and as well as including some of the paintings, the artwork that Todd collected as part of his travels in Rajasthan. And Jaz, I know you're particularly excited about this, so can you tell us why?
Yeah, for me, I don't know if this, can we have the pictures up on the
I don't
on the
believe
screen?
the PowerPoint's on. If we can have
we just
wanted to give you a sense of some of the...
We can have the images.
Why don't you answer
the PPT on?
We'll
Okay.
ask for the
So,
PowerPoint.
as an art historian, one of the things that interests me about James Todd's book always has is that it's an illustrated book, and it, as Norbert mentioned, and actually is unusual for a book of that period to have so many illustrations. There had, of course, been other artists who had produced prints of other parts of India, notably the Daniels. They didn't come to Rajasthan. But other major history works of the early 19th century are usually just letterpress, not images. So restoring the images, my edition of Todd, the one that I use daily, was printed in the 1970s, and it gives no proper sense of the original book at all, but also it doesn't give a proper sense of Todd's engagement with Rajasthan, because Todd's engagement was not just with the Bardic Chronicles, the history as he understood it, or it was explained to him by his informants, but an engagement with the visual and material culture of Rajasthan. And he does this in a number of ways. He travels a lot, particularly through southern Rajasthan. He visits numerous sites, and he is accompanied by 2 artists. One of them is actually the captain of his bodyguard, Captain War, whose main job is to protect him, but is trained, like many military men of his period were, as a draftsman. And the other is a borrowed court artist called Ghazi, borrowed from the court of Udaipur. And wherever they go, he sets these 2 people to produce views of what they see. And if the images come up, you'll see actually they're quite interesting to compare them. You get somewhat different perspectives from the two artists. Garci, the Indian artist, does much more carefully delineated line drawings of details of temples and of carvings and so on. War is going for the picturesque view, for the collapsing temple in the jungle kind of thing. But the two together give you a sense of, they also relate to aspects of Todd's own engagement, where he's again trying both to delineate precisely elements of what he sees and knows and understands, but also to give a kind of more perspective view, if you like. So I think that seeing the images alongside the text gives a much richer understanding of what Todd is about. And that's why I'm particularly delighted that the RAS in reissuing the book has decided to include the images again. I hope you're going to see some of them in a second.
Let me jump in, because one of the very exciting images that is in the collection of the Royal Asiatic Society is a watercolor done by Captain Waugh, but in the idiom of a Rajasthani miniature. And this encapsulates this moment of, which was still possible in the early 19th century, of dialogue between skilled Indian craftsmen or skilled Indian historians and the early British administrators of this area at the time. And still in the early 19th century, one can see amongst the Europeans here in Rajasthan who were very small in number. Todd's entire European contingent consisted of exactly 4 people during the 17 years that he lived in Rajasthan. His primary engagement in this time was with Indians. And through looking at Captain Waugh's attempts to master Indian techniques in miniature painting, we can see an inquisitiveness, an openness to what was around them that sadly became lost as the 19th century moved along.
Thanks, Norbert. That you've brought in an element of explaining to us how Todd worked, which is one of the questions I was going to get to. But it's great that you pulled that into this one. I want to move on to Rima, as the historian on the panel. So Todd is supposed to be the historian of Rajasthan. So would you like to comment on that? But also, what did being a historian mean in the 18th or 19th centuries vis-a-vis now? What is the difference in the job description, but as well as the readership, the people who are consuming these histories? How differently do we understand history today?
Right. Well, I guess before I come to this fact of being a historian in the 18th, 19th century versus now, or even I answer it at all, I don't know if Todd ever thought of himself as a historian. I know we do now. And because I live and teach in Rajasthan, I get a lot of this of, what did he know about Indian history? What did he know about local history? What did he know about the languages? Point is, he was, as he says, annals. He was recording what he was getting, but he was recording it in a certain way. He was going through it. But what is poignant for me are some of the letters. They're not that many. In one of which he's been asked by Colin Mackenzie, who was then, I think, either at what was then Madras or some place where he's asked for some coins from this area to add to the collection of the East India Company. And he replies after a long time, he says, you'll have to excuse me for this delay, but you will need to understand that it has been 2 years since I wrote to my own family. Now that can be a dysfunctional family, that's one aspect. But he says, I've been involved with a lot of things which are actually, we know now that he was dealing with the political issues of the time, the place of the ruler versus the nobles and things like that. He's also mapping, as in, actual latitude, longitude, drawing of maps for the East India Company. So he's doing a whole lot of things. And not necessarily being a historian, which is to come back to your thing, of what a historian would have been recording at that time. He does do that. So again, there's another letter in which again is used by some of my colleagues to kind of flag and throw flack at Todd by saying he doesn't know his Indian languages. So in this very British style, he says, well, he admires his guru, the Yati Gyanchanda, and he says he's adept in Magdhi, Saraswati, the language of the gods, and he names several. And he says, and I understand a little and muddle through. And people jump on that and say, see, he's muddling through. Whereas he's saying this in this very self-deprecatory style of, I know a little bit. But then again, from what he says, I have given my people instructions. Whenever we make a camp, we try and talk to the local people. And basically what he was doing is he was trawling, to use today's terms, trawling for knowledge. And he collects it all. And then somewhere else in another letter he says, in my mind's eye, I have this beautiful lake, which is now, is it the Jag Nivas or the Jag Mandir, I mean, in Lake Pichola, the one which is not the Lake Palace, but the other one. But that had been made available for him at a point when he was not so well. And he says, in my mind's eye, that's where I would like to be, to write about this land. Now the point is, he did not have the leisure to be a historian, and I don't know if he had the ambitions to be a historian. He was perhaps much more in the style of the diarist of his era, though he was taking records, and not just of the Rasos. You know, there's been a lot of written about how he hears the story of Prithviraj Chauhan and he just takes it on. Now, I've come across his handwritten translation of the Jaisalmer, one of the Jaisalmer Khyats, which is in pencil, not even in ink, where he's trying to do a line-by-line thing. So, as I said, he's trawling for knowledge, but he's getting it from various sources, oral, inscriptions, a lot of which, and that's why I'm excited to hear, you know, I'm almost salivating at the idea of what Norway is talking about.
So how would you rate Todd as a historian? Is he still a reliable source of information? You know, should we all go and get our copies of Todd if we want to learn about the history of Rajasthan? It's open to all of you.
I think if we look at Todd again, and as you are doing, if anyone who looks even at their edition, because he makes no claim to being a historian, he often also says, I have heard this. You know, he's actually backing away. He's being authoritative at times, and he's got his facts wrong, yes. I think the problem came with a lot of people in historians of Rajasthan using him as a kind of base. And later on, of course, then it's much easier to say, oh, Dr. Tillotson says this, he is wrong. But if Dr. Tillotson hadn't said it in the first place, my attention may not have been drawn to that. So when in the 19th century, 50 years after him, somebody writes about some area, or somebody pulls out a much earlier record in Rajasthan, in Marwadi, say the Khyat of Nancy, and then says, look at the difference, he's wrong. It's easy to do things, you know, with hindsight, right? How would one rate him today? I think what's intriguing for me, for a lot of people of this kind of 19th century, is their biases come through. So his kind of glorification of the Rajputs in his own mind is coming through. And if you take that away, it's easier to get to truth, whatever that truth is, much more than if I write now in the 21st century being politically correct and being, you know, I have to say this in a certain way. And I would still have my biases, but they may not come through in that way.
Jared, do you want to?
I think if somebody came to me, a student came and said they wanted to study Rajasthani history, where would they start? I wouldn't direct them to Todd, I'd direct them to Rima Huja.
Thank you for that.
But I read Todd for the pleasure of reading Todd. I mean, I read him as a literary source. He writes beautifully, but also to understand Rajasthan of the early 19th century, of his own time. And I think also to try to understand how much our understanding, particularly again of the material culture of Rajasthan, was shaped by Todd. If we could have the picture back again, the picture that was on the screen just before it disappeared, if that could come back, was Patrick Waugh's drawing of one of the palaces in Chittor. Can we have it back? Yeah, there, okay. No, that's right, that's see, that one.
Yeah.
It's perhaps difficult to grasp now because, you know, if you go to Chittor, you're immediately told by a guide or by a book, you know, this is the palace of Kumbha and this is the palace of Ratan Singh and so on and so forth. How do we know which is which? Because the thing was no longer used as a military base after Akbar's sack of Chittor. The place was under cultivation. When the answer is from Todd, essentially. The earliest lengthy description we have, an identification of the ruins of Chittor, is from Todd. There was nothing before that, I don't just mean in English, I mean in any language. So where does he get it from? Obviously he arrives there and some of the area is under cultivation. He talks to the local farmers. He even describes upsetting a group of old men playing pachisi to ask them questions, you know, about, obviously he's come, he's read all these sources, his head is full of the stories of Rani Padmini and so on and so forth. So he's going to say to these guys, you know, where's this palace, where's that palace, and so on. And of course they're very helpful, and they say, well, according to us, you know, Padmini's palace is that one. So war is sat down and told to draw it. And so that's how we know. So he's recording the oral tradition of the early 19th century. And if he hadn't done that, we would have very, very little clue as to which is which. I mean, obviously the temples are a different matter because you can identify them by the idols or by inscriptions, but particularly for the secular architecture, for the palaces and the military architecture, Todd's early description is crucial. And then when you get to a later period of the 19th century when the Archaeological Survey of India is invited in and there's the first survey by Garrick, it's all just quoting Todd. And then everybody quotes Garrick quoting Todd, and so on and so forth. And so an enormous amount, I think, of our understanding. Obviously, you're right, no historian is going to be unchallenged for 200 years. And we have completely different readings of some of the source material that he believed, including, as Ramya Srinivasan pointed out, particularly about Rani Padmini. But nevertheless, I think he's still there, still worth reading.
Norbert, would you like to pitch in?
Actually, I just would like to jump in here to reinforce what Rima said. As a historian for periods earlier than his own time, one would have to parse Todd's text very carefully and beware of the information that he provides. However, if one looks at him as an observer of what the historical sensibilities of the people of Rajasthan had at that moment in the early 19th century, he was a brilliant observer. He took into account an extremely wide range of data that was considered to be of historical irrelevance within a European tradition. And he said, this is important to how the people of Rajasthan construct their past history. This is how they understand their past history and how it lives within them. And he tried to give a very nuanced and lively sense and sensibility of what the textures of time were for Rajasthani people in the early 19th century. In a sense, he was really our first ethnohistorian. Is an academic field that has burgeoned in the 200 years later. He was just ahead of his time, and it is the reading of his text in that light as a commentary on Rajasthan in the early 19th century, which is extremely important.
Well, just to jump in there for half a second, well, more than half a second, he talks about the widowed queen of Bundi, who he has made his Rakhi sister. But he uses that also to talk about how erudite she is and everything, but also the education that a woman of that period might be getting. Now, even if you don't generalize, he does give you a clear image of the letters he's having from this one queen and the level of education she may have had, which is not formal education, but it certainly puts paid to the idea of, Rajasthan and women being totally illiterate. And after all, what is literacy? That's another point. But he is a good, as you say, recording what he has around him in so many different ways.
From the education or lack thereof, however he puts it, of the Queen of Bundi, I want to jump to Todd's own education, his own background, because what we read and what we see in the world around us, the people, the circumstances, the politics, all of that influences the way we ourselves, for example, read and understand Todd. So what was he influenced by in terms of education, in terms of the world he lived in, what was going on around him? What's the background? Who wants to go first?
Well, you need to take account of the fact, because he starts his service very young. He's still a teenager.
17.
He doesn't have the advantage of a university education. So when we talk about him being grounded in attitudes and sensibilities of his own time, these are things that he's imbibing as he goes along. It's not to say he arrives in India with an enormous education already behind him. And in that sense, that makes him much more flexible. And I think some historians like Jason Freitag have written about him having multiple voices in one author, precisely because he's listening to multiple voices and trying to project them. That he's steeped in a kind of Georgian style of historiography, which he's getting from his Western background, but equally he's listening to the bardic traditions of Rajasthan. He's able to sort of amalgamate these things.
And it seems to me that we have different Todds also in the Annals and Antiquities and the Travels in Western India. Because, as Giles says, he's this young man who comes out with a certain amount of reading, writing, arithmetic equivalent, and then he picks up things from where he goes. But by the time he gets around to writing, he's a mature man who is back in England. So he actually leaves India, at this point where he's possibly in his late 20s. And he's always hankering for that India he's left. So a lot of the kind of political ideas or the politicization of his voice takes place when he's back in England or Great Britain, as it still was, and taking in what has been happening in Europe, particularly, I guess, in France.
In France.
A lot. And you might want to jump in on that.
Yeah, one of the issues that Ramya and I are also interested in bringing out, and this really speaks directly to the theme of the afterlives of James Todd's Annals and Antiquities, is how his work was used from the time it first came out through the later 19th century amongst European political philosophers in helping in how they came up with ideas about nationalism. Because one of the themes that Todd wrote about with respect to the Rajputs was their strong sense of national identity and national character. This is a moment in Europe when notions of nationalism, the idea about nationalism, was just emerging for the first time. And many of Todd's ideas actually were crystallized while he was still here in India, not when he was in Britain. And he married. Obviously, the notion of nationalism itself, broadly written, is a European notion, but much of the texture that he brought to his understanding of it was developed here in Rajasthan. And he brought this back to London when he published his Rajasthan. It was picked up by political philosophers in London, such as John Stuart Mill, who then began applying Todd's ideas about Rajput nationalism to other European nations, and particularly the French. So one of the aspects of the conversation that we're trying to bring out that existed between Todd and India is that conversation, which started here in Rajasthan, had profound reverberations in the United Kingdom as well.
Can I just say, on the matter of the political uses of Todd, there's another aspect which we haven't touched on, and another reason that I think it's important to remember him and to understand Todd, is that to see Todd as an early proponent of indirect rule. Mrinalini mentioned his falling out with his superior, David Ochterlony. It was precisely over this issue that he was advocating leaving a greater degree of independence for the Rajput states than some of his superiors thought appropriate. That argument resurfaced later with the parliamentary inquiry of 1832, where he's pitted against Mill, who's arguing for annexation, for the doctrine of lapse, and Todd, back in Britain, is arguing very strongly for leaving the princely states alone, essentially, particularly the Rajputs, because he sees them as a fully formed nation. He loses that debate for a while, but after 1857, when the whole issue is revisited, there comes to be an awareness that actually Todd had been right all along. And that is why, after 1857, there is no further doctrine of lapse. There are no further annexations. In other words, of course, he doesn't live to see that, to see his ideas. He's dead by then. Yeah. But nevertheless, he's also important, therefore, as a figure to remind us of the fractured nature of company rule, that it isn't this monolith, this homogeneous, ideologically homogeneous power. There are dissenting voices within it, even if sometimes those dissenting voices were marginalized, as was Todd. It's to our good fortune that he was marginalized in a sense, because it gave him ample time, sitting in the library of the Royal Asiatic Society, to write his fantastic book.
And that brings me to, because if we're going to allow the audience to ask us questions, to the last thing that I wanted to ask, which is a question really about legacies. What does Todd's book achieve? What agenda do you think that he had? Do you think he had? I mean, was it a conscious one? You've touched upon some of these issues actually in some of the discussion already, but if you could just draw together in terms of seeing it, in terms of a legacy, what does he achieve? What does the book achieve? And also, but equally, what does it exclude? What do the Annals and Antiquities not tell us about? Who or what?
I think on that one we're going to need another panel. What does he not tell us? But just to take on from what Giles said, the impact that Todd has on the nature of politics and the nature of how India or the other colonies of that time are seen is one thing. But even within India, this non-historian then becomes the base on which a lot of histories are written, which is why he does take flack, as I say. But then he also becomes inspirational when we have the nationalist school of writing, but even before that, in Bengal, Abhinandanath takes up the thing, and so you have you have stories in Bengali, you have stories in Gujarati, and what is interesting is a lot of nationally known figures today are the ones that Todd has highlighted, I mean among many, but they're the ones who've been then picked up in different regional language writings and given even more spotlight. So that it's not that he's left anyone, he has left many out. But the ones out of the ones that he's highlighting, more than get further highlighted. So we actually look at something known to us as an integral part of Indian history, which is why I questioned this bit about, even what is a historian, and realize that out of the many, many, many characters from the pages of history, to use that old-fashioned phrase, he has picked a few and then they get repicked and become our window to Todd's past.
Giles, and then I'm going to let Norbert have the last
to
word.
give just one example from Green's, so one of the figures obviously that he focuses on would be something like Rana Pratap, who has a very high profile even today, and I think we owe some of that to Todd. The people that he leaves out of his history are most of the people of Rajasthan who weren't Rajputs. It's not Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, properly speaking, it's the Annals and Antiquities of the Rajputs. And I think that we live, that's part of the legacy as well, that a lot of the later historiography of Rajasthan focuses on the ruling clans rather than on the much more complex society that Rajasthan always has been. And I think we've inherited that bias.
So Giles, that apostrophe is actually Raja's style, I think. I don't know if that was the case in his mind, but to me it is.
And Norbert, the last word before we open up for questions.
Well, I would just reiterate what Rima said, is that he did have a profound impact on how the nationalist leaders in India in the later 19th century began to articulate a pan-Indian national identity. So they used a lot of they used the Rajputs as an example of a nascent identity, and they expanded it to include all of India. And it's one of the reasons why he was looked upon favorably by nationalist leaders in a way that many other British authors were not, and why he's still, reasonably well regarded, particularly here in Rajasthan.
Is he reasonably well regarded? As I said,
we could take a poll, and some of the questions might tell us what people in the audience think. We have exactly 3 minutes on the counter. Okay, we have literally 3 minutes. Okay, so the gentleman in front.
Hello.
She's in charge of the mic, so it's whoever she
gives
the mic to. Yeah.
Hello, madam, sir. There's a wonderful essay by William Jones on the poetry of the Eastern nations. And it's a glorious romanticization of the poets of India and Middle East. And how do you see Todd's work? Do you think it's a true justice? Is it a romanticization? Or is it relevant in the current time?
Take the second question and then one answer.
And please, could you keep it brief so that we have some time to respond?
I have a very brief question. That is, would you rate him as the first travel writer of Rajasthan who went extensively, for in tourism, I went on referring to his books for the festival detailing.
I think we can certainly regard him as a travel writer, and the personal narrative that comes at the end of the 2 volumes are wonderful evocations of his travels through landscape, and certainly the most readable bits. In response to the first question, I would just say, looking back now, yes, I mean, a lot of history written at that time may seem romantic, and some of it is his romanticism. There's a book of essays by the Rudolphs on him called Romanticism's Child. But it's also reflecting the romanticism of the Rajput bards themselves. I mean, that's what he's picking up on particularly, is the language and spirit of the source material that he's using. And it's not perhaps apparent to the reader the extent to which large chunks of this text are just paraphrases, almost translations of historical texts that he's worked through.
And I think what's coming through, is that he is enamored of the place he is. He's actually not being a sit back, look at it, analyze it. He is kind of very visceral in his reactions to what is around him. So, he's not trying to be a true whatever, Nobel.
actually I would agree with certainly with what Giles said about the Romanticism, is that he was using European Romanticism as an idiom to make the Romanticism of the Bardic tradition accessible to a European audience. So he was engaged in an active translation. Any active translation inevitably leads to some element of distortion. But that's all we have if we're wanting to have a first approximation for understanding. And without a doubt, he is guilty, as was Jones, of slightly over-egging his representation. But that was the resource he had available to make Rajasthan accessible to a European audience that would have no connection to it whatsoever. Unlike us, who were able to come here and experience for ourselves what Rajasthan is like. But in the early 19th century, his readership in the UK would not have known, except through his prose.
Thank you very much. Thank you
very much.
Thank you to you all for coming.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause for a lovely panel.